The old portrait sat in the corner, a quiet presence that most people walked right past. It was from 1875, a painting of a Victorian woman, and at first glance it seemed perfectly ordinary. You'd notice the elegant sweep of her dress, the way her hands rested gently in her lap, and the soft, almost tranquil look on her face. It had that classic, period charm, the kind you'd expect from a forgotten piece of history. Nobody really knew where it came from, or who painted it, or even who the woman was. It had just shown up in a dusty auction lot years ago, passed through a few hands, and ended up in a neglected private collection, waiting for someone to truly see it. But if you stood there for a moment longer, letting your eyes drift over the canvas, a tiny detail would catch your attention. It wasn't obvious, not at all. Maybe a strange shadow in the folds of her gown, or an odd highlight in the background. It looked like nothing more than an artistic quirk, a brushstroke that went a little wrong, or maybe just some grime that had built up over the decades. Still, there was a fleeting sense of something being a little bit off. It wasn't sinister, not yet, just perplexing, like a word on the tip of your tongue you couldn't quite remember. This was how Dr. Eleanor Vance first encountered it. Eleanor was an art historian, sharp and meticulous, with a special interest in Victorian art. She loved the details, the hidden meanings, the stories paintings could tell. She found the portrait during an appraisal of that neglected private collection, tucked away behind larger, more flashy pieces. She was immediately drawn to its technical skill, the way the artist had captured the light, and the woman's expression, so calm, yet with a hint of something unreadable in her eyes. It was a good painting, she thought, a solid example of the period, and she spent a good hour just studying its surface. As she spent more time with the portrait, her initial fascination began to shift. She'd find herself walking back to it, drawn by an invisible thread. Each time, that subtle detail, whatever it was, seemed to assert itself a little more. It wasn't just a quirk anymore. It was something that seemed to be actively trying to get her attention. She started feeling a persistent unease whenever she looked at it for too long. It was a strange sensation, like the painting was holding its breath, or maybe even watching her. She'd turn away, then look back quickly, half expecting to catch it in the act. Of course, it never moved. It was just paint on canvas, yet the feeling lingered. Sometimes, when she was alone in the room with the portrait, she'd feel a sudden drop in temperature, a cold spot that made the hairs on her arms stand up, or a faint prickle, like static electricity, would buzz in the air around the canvas. She'd tell herself it was just the old building, the drafts, the dry air. But the feeling of not being truly alone, even when the room was empty, started to become more frequent. The woman's eyes, painted with such careful realism, really did seem to follow her. She knew it was an optical illusion, a trick of perspective that artists used all the time. But with this portrait it felt different, more profound, like the gaze held a real, conscious weight. Then came the first unsettling incident. She was working late, cataloguing other pieces in the collection, when she heard a soft thud from the portrait's corner. She looked up. A heavy art history book, one she had left propped against the wall earlier, had fallen flat onto the floor. There was no breeze, no vibration from outside. The room was perfectly still. A few minutes later, the single incandescent bulb illuminating the portrait flickered, then went out completely, plunging that section of the room into darkness. Eleanor fumbled for her flashlight, her heart beating a little faster. She quickly switched out the bulb, telling herself it was just an old fixture, a loose connection. And the book? It must have been unstable. She dismissed it as fatigue, an overactive imagination working overtime in a quiet, old house. But the seed of doubt, tiny and sharp, had been planted. The woman in the portrait, who had initially seemed so serene, now appeared to Eleanor to possess a melancholic quality. Her expression, once tranquil, now felt almost haunted. That subtle, unsettling detail had changed Eleanor's perception of the whole piece. The woman's gaze seemed more intense, her faint smile more artificial, almost forced. It was as if her painted form was merely a vessel, holding something else within. Eleanor found herself staring at the portrait for long stretches, no longer admiring its artistry, but trying to decipher its secret. What is truly hidden here? She started asking herself, out loud sometimes, when no one else was around. The mystery of the portrait began to overshadow its artistic merit, the beauty of its brushstrokes, the elegance of its subject. It was no longer just a piece of art. It was a puzzle, a silent challenge. A growing compulsion to uncover the truth behind that unsettling detail had taken root in Eleanor's mind, and she knew she wouldn't rest until she figured it out. It was a feeling she couldn't shake, a quiet insistence that this painting was more than it appeared, and she was going to find out why. That quiet insistence, that gnawing feeling, quickly turned into a full-blown obsession. Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about the portrait. She knew she needed to dig deeper, to move beyond just looking at the painting and start looking into its past. Her meticulous nature, usually focused on brushstrokes and stylistic periods, now shifted to detective work. She began a thorough historical investigation into the portrait's origins, hoping to find some clue, any clue that would explain the unease it caused. Her first step was to comb through old auction records. She spent hours in dusty archives, flipping through brittle pages of catalogues from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She cross-referenced private collection inventories, looking for any mention of a portrait matching the description, the date, the style. She even delved into forgotten art dealer ledgers, hoping to find a paper trail. But it was like the painting had simply appeared out of nowhere. There was an initial lack of concrete information, which only deepened the mystery. It was frustrating, but also, in a strange way, exciting. Every dead end just told her how well hidden this story was. After weeks of fruitless searching, she finally found a tiny, almost overlooked entry in a very old, handwritten inventory from a defunct estate. It was a brief mention of a portrait, Lady in Blue, commissioned in 1875 by a Mr. Alistair Finch. The description was vague, but the date and the general style fit. Mr. Alistair Finch. The name sounded old-fashioned, almost theatrical. The inventory hinted at him being a reclusive, eccentric figure, known for his unusual interests. There were vague whispers of strange practices, of him keeping to himself in a large, isolated manner. It wasn't much, but it was a lead. The problem was Mr. Finch's name was difficult to trace further. He seemed to have vanished from public record after a certain point, adding another layer of obfuscation to the whole affair. It felt like trying to catch smoke. Eleanor decided to broaden her search. If historical records were silent, perhaps local law wasn't. She began researching the region where the Finch estate was supposedly located, a small, forgotten corner of the countryside. She spent days sifting through local historical society documents, old newspaper clippings, and even obscure folklore collections. And that's when things started to get really interesting. She uncovered local legends, whispered tales from that very region, stories of unexplained disappearances that were never solved, strange occurrences that people attributed to the old ways, and a pervasive sense of dread that had settled over the area for generations. These stories, once dismissed as mere superstition, now resonated eerily with her growing unease about the painting. They spoke of shadows, of things that weren't quite human, of deals made in secret. Then she found something about the artist. The painting was unsigned, which was not uncommon for the period, but the style was so distinctive. After much effort, she managed to identify the likely painter, a relatively obscure artist named Thomas Blackwood. He was known for his technical skill, especially his ability to capture light and texture, but also for his unusual methods and reclusive nature. What really caught Eleanor's attention were the rumors surrounding him, whispers of Blackwood's sudden disappearance after completing a certain difficult commission, or an abrupt end to his promising career right around 1875. Some said he simply stopped painting, others claimed he went mad. There was a sense that the artist was either deeply complicit in or profoundly affected by the creation of this particular portrait. It made Eleanor wonder what exactly Blackwood had seen or done. Driven by a new hunch, Eleanor arranged for a small sample of the paint and canvas to be analyzed in the museum's conservation lab. She wanted to know exactly what materials Blackwood had used. The results were surprising. The analysis revealed not only unusual pigments, some sourced from very obscure regions, but also strange binders mixed into the paint. There were subtle inconsistencies that suggested non-standard practices, even experimental techniques. It wasn't just linseed oil and turpentine. There were traces of things the conservators couldn't quite identify, organic compounds that didn't belong. It hinted that the materials themselves might hold a clue, as if the very substance of the painting was part of the secret. Her investigation took a dark turn when she stumbled upon a journal fragment. It wasn't a full journal, just a few loose, yellowed pages tucked inside a book on Victorian spiritualism that had once belonged to the Finch estate. The handwriting was spidery and almost illegible, filled with cross-outs and frantic scribbles. The entries were vague and fear-filled, hinting at a presence or influence during the painting process. The author, whose name was not clear, spoke of sacrifices and unseen forces. One particular line chilled Eleanor to the bone. It demands more than paint. The fragment didn't directly mention the portrait, but the timing and the context felt too close to be a coincidence. As Eleanor delved deeper into the portrait's history, the painting itself seemed to respond. She began to experience vivid nightmares connected to the portrait. She'd see the woman in the painting, but her face would be distorted, her eyes wide with terror, her serene smile twisted into a silent scream. Sometimes the unsettling detail from the portrait, that strange, almost imperceptible smudge would grow in her dreams, becoming a gaping maw or a swirling vortex. She'd wake up in a cold sweat. The image burned into her mind. The inexplicable phenomena around the portrait intensified. One morning, she found a small, heavy inkwell from her desk moved to the floor, directly in front of the painting. She distinctly remembered leaving it on her desk. Other times, faint, cloying smells of decay, or, oddly, a very sweet, old-fashioned perfume would emanate from the canvas, only to vanish moments later. The feeling of being watched became almost constant, a heavy weight on her shoulders, even when she was in other parts of the museum. The portrait wasn't just a painting anymore. It felt like a living, breathing entity, slowly waking up, its influence growing stronger with every secret Eleanor uncovered. The intensity of these experiences pushed Eleanor to a new level of urgency. She knew she couldn't rely on traditional art historical methods alone anymore. The portrait was clearly more than just canvas and paint, and it demanded a different kind of investigation. She decided it was time to bring in the heavy artillery, advanced imaging techniques. Her goal was to peer beneath the surface, to see what the artist, Blackwood, had truly hidden. She arranged for the portrait to be moved to a specialized imaging lab within the museum, a sterile room equipped with state-of-the-art technology, usually reserved for detecting forgeries or restoring badly damaged works. The first step was a series of X-rays. These were typically used to reveal underdrawings or changes in composition, showing layers of paint that weren't visible to the naked eye. As the X-rays passed through the canvas, the initial images flickered across the screen. There were indeed some faint lines, suggesting an earlier pose for the woman's hand, but nothing overtly strange. Then came the infrared photography. This technique could often penetrate darker pigments, revealing details that might have been painted over. Again, the images showed the expected, the artist's initial sketches, some subtle corrections. Nothing explained the growing dread Eleanor felt. But when they switched to UV light, things began to get interesting. UV light reacts differently to various organic and inorganic materials, often highlighting repairs, later additions, or even certain types of varnish. As the UV lamp bathed the portrait, a faint, non-organic signature appeared in the specific area where Eleanor had noticed the unsettling detail, that almost imperceptible smudge on the woman's dress. It wasn't a brushstroke, nor was it a natural discoloration of the pigment. It was something else entirely, a strange energy reading that emitted a dull, almost sickly glow under the ultraviolet light. It was faint, barely there, but undeniably present and alien to the surrounding paint. This initial anomaly was enough to warrant further, more precise investigation. Eleanor instructed the technicians to focus all their efforts on that specific spot, using micro-CT scans and even spectral analysis, techniques that could break down the composition of materials at a molecular level. The process was slow, painstaking, and required absolute precision. Each scan built upon the last, slowly peeling back the layers of deception. It became clear that whatever was there was not a mistake or an artistic change. It was a deliberate concealment, meticulously crafted to remain hidden unless actively sought out with specific tools. Then the subsurface revelation began to emerge. As the high-resolution scans processed the data, a clear outline began to form. It wasn't a pattern or a random shape. It was a form, almost like a miniature carving, embedded within the paint layers themselves. It was not painted on top. It was integrated, as if the canvas had been manipulated, almost sculpted, before the final layers of paint were applied. The technicians, usually stoic and detached, exchanged uneasy glances. They had never seen anything like it. The final image solidified on the main monitor, a stark, undeniable presence. The hidden detail was finally unveiled. It was a tiny, grotesque, almost demonic face. It was not a flat image, but seemed to possess a three-dimensional quality, as if a minuscule, shriveled head had been pressed into the canvas and then painted over. The face was contorted in what could only be described as agony or malevolence. Its eyes, though tiny, seemed to pierce through the layers of paint, staring out from within the very fabric of the portrait. It was meticulously crafted, yes, but designed with such cunning to be almost imperceptible to the naked eye, a dark secret held just beneath the surface. Eleanor felt a cold dread wash over her, a profound shock that went beyond intellectual curiosity. A visceral sense of horror seized her. Her breath caught in her throat. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. The portrait was not merely unsettling, it was inherently sinister. The previous inexplicable phenomena, the cold spots, the whispers, the moved objects, her nightmares, they all clicked into place, making terrifying, chilling sense. This was not a trick of light or an overactive imagination. This was real. As the hidden detail was exposed on the screen, the atmosphere in the lab, usually clinical and quiet, dramatically shifted. The fluorescent lights flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows across the room. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature made them all shiver, despite the controlled environment. Then, a peculiar sensation, like a heavy weight pressing down, filled the room. On the main portrait itself, now back in its frame and under normal lighting, the eyes of the woman in the painting seemed to burn with an unnatural intensity, a malevolent spark that hadn't been there before. It was as if the act of revealing the hidden face had awakened something further within the painting. Eleanor immediately connected the grotesque detail to the local legends she had uncovered. The whispers of strange occurrences, the pervasive sense of dread, the disappearances, they all resonated with the image on the screen. The symbol or face wasn't just a random artistic flourish. It was too specific, too deliberately evil. It had to be a known sigil from obscure occult practices, or perhaps a direct representation of a malevolent entity, a dark spirit. The stories of vanishings and strange deaths in the region suddenly gained chilling, undeniable credibility. Eleanor was no longer just curious. She was genuinely deeply frightened. The portrait was no longer merely an art object, a historical artifact to be studied. It was a vessel for something dark, powerful, and now actively aware. The compulsion to understand had shifted into an urgent, desperate need to neutralize or contain this threat. Her academic pursuit had become a terrifying confrontation with something ancient and evil, locked away in a gilded frame. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had stumbled upon a secret far more dangerous than she could have ever imagined. Eleanor knew she couldn't waste a second. The chilling revelation of the grotesque face beneath the serene facade had transformed her mission from academic curiosity to a race against an unknown, terrifying force. Her first priority was to decipher the symbol. She dove headfirst into her research, abandoning her usual meticulous schedule for a frantic, obsessive quest. Her office became a war room, littered with forgotten books on demonology, ancient cults, and forgotten rituals. She scoured digitized archives, obscure university libraries, and even contacted colleagues known for their unconventional interests. The symbol she discovered was not unique. It was a specific sigil, a binding mark, used in certain European folk magic traditions from the late 19th century, a period often dismissed by mainstream scholars as mere superstition. It wasn't a representation of a high-ranking demon, but rather a mark to bind a lesser, but still malevolent, entity. This binding was meant to draw power, to feed, and to exert influence over a specific person or place. The deeper she dug, the clearer the picture of the reclusive patron became. This individual, previously a shadowy figure in the few records she'd found, was not just eccentric, they were deeply, dangerously involved in occult practices. The portrait, Eleanor now understood, was not merely a commission for vanity, it was a central component of a dark ritual. The sigil, the meticulous detail, the hidden placement, it all pointed to a deliberate act of binding. The patron's true intent, she pieced together from fragmented historical accounts and whispered warnings in dusty tomes, was to trap a spirit, perhaps to gain eternal youth, or to exert control over a rival, or even to simply feed their own twisted sense of power. The goal was always self-serving, always at the expense of another. The artist, too, began to emerge from the shadows of history in a new, more tragic light. Initial records suggested a skilled but reclusive painter whose career abruptly ended around 1875. Now, Eleanor found hints of coercion, desperate letters to family members mentioning an oppressive client, and even cryptic diary entries describing a terrible burden and unholy requests. It seemed the artist was either blackmailed into participating or, perhaps more chillingly, unknowingly became a pawn in a ritual far beyond their comprehension. Their sudden disappearance or descent into madness after completing the portrait was no longer a coincidence, but a direct consequence. They were either a victim, their life ruined by their complicity, or a willing participant who later regretted their actions, driven mad by the horror they helped create. And then there was the woman in the portrait. Her serene expression, once a captivating enigma, now seemed like a mask of profound tragedy. She was not just a model, she was the central figure in this depraved act. Eleanor found no definitive identity for her, only vague descriptions of a beautiful young woman, often seen in the company of the patron before her sudden disappearance. Her serene expression was a facade, a cruel mockery of her true condition or fate. The portrait captured her at a pivotal, horrific moment, perhaps as her essence, her very soul, was being bound. The beauty was a lure, the stillness a trap. Eleanor pieced together fragments of information describing a ritual designed to bind a spirit or an aspect of a soul into an artifact. The portrait, with its layers of paint and carefully prepared canvas, served as the perfect medium. It was a prison, meticulously constructed. The grotesque hidden detail was not just a symbol, it was the final, sealing mark of this dark pact, a lock on a spiritual cage. The painting was not a representation of a woman, it was the woman, or at least a significant part of her, trapped and suffering. With this new understanding, the painting was no longer just an image. It was an active conduit. It drew energy, Eleanor suspected, feeding on fear, on unease, subtly influencing its surroundings. The inexplicable phenomena she and others had experienced, the cold spots, the whispers, the flickering lights, the growing sense of dread, were not random occurrences. They were manifestations of the bound entity's struggle, its malevolence, its desperate attempts to exert influence, or perhaps its cries for help. The longer it remained bound, the more potent its effects seemed to become. The portrait's influence was indeed growing, spilling beyond the confines of the gallery and into the wider museum. Staff members began reporting feeling unwell, plagued by vivid nightmares that left them exhausted and fearful. There were whispers of uncharacteristic anger, short tempers, and a general malaise pervading the building. Eleanor herself felt increasingly drained, her once sharp mind clouded by a constant fog of anxiety. She found herself emotionally volatile, snapping at colleagues, struggling to focus. The portrait was leeching her energy, feeding on her fear, on her very being. This realization brought a terrifying urgency. Merely understanding the portrait wasn't enough. The entity bound within was growing stronger, its influence spreading like a poison. She had to act. She had to find a way to sever the connection, to destroy the binding, to free the trapped soul without unleashing something far worse. The academic quest had become a desperate fight for survival, not just for herself, but for anyone who came near the cursed canvas. The answers she sought now only intensified the danger. The academic quest had become a desperate fight for survival, not just for herself, but for anyone who came near the cursed canvas. The answers she sought now only intensified the danger. Eleanor knew she couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. She dove deeper into the dusty archives, driven by a new, chilling purpose: to uncover the full identity of the man responsible for this horror. After weeks of relentless searching, cross-referencing obscure genealogical records and old property deeds, she finally found him. The patron's full identity was Sir Alistair Finch. He wasn't just some reclusive eccentric, he was a notorious figure, whispered about in hushed tones, even in historical texts. His family lineage was steeped in dark rumors, connecting them to other historical atrocities and unexplained disappearances across England. He was known for his dark experiments, his obsession with the occult, and a truly cruel nature that made him a pariah, even among his wealthy peers. Sir Alistair Finch had a long, disturbing history of exploiting vulnerable individuals for his dark purposes. The woman in the portrait, Eleanor discovered, was named Clara Beaumont. She was a beautiful, talented young seamstress from a respectable but financially struggling family. Clara had been drawn into Finch's orbit under the guise of an artistic commission, a promise of patronage that would secure her family's future. She was, Eleanor realized with a pang of sorrow, likely one of many victims chosen for her ethereal beauty, and more tragically, her inherent vulnerability and trusting nature. Finch's methods involved a calculated blend of psychological torment and what Eleanor now understood to be potent magical coercion, slowly eroding Clara's will until she was a shell of her former self, ripe for his sinister ritual. As Eleanor delved further into Finch's past, more details about the artist's predicament emerged. The artist, a reclusive but brilliant painter named Arthur Penhaligon, had been a rising star before his sudden disappearance. It seemed Penhaligon wasn't a willing participant in the ritual, but a trapped one. He was likely threatened, perhaps even blackmailed by Finch, forced to immortalize Clara's torment on canvas. The subtle artistic choices in the portrait that Eleanor had initially admired as mastery now appeared as desperate cries for help or hidden warnings. The faint, almost imperceptible lines in the background, the way Clara's gaze seemed to plead rather than simply observe. These weren't just artistic nuances, they were Penhaligon's silent screams, his desperate attempt to embed clues within the painting itself, hoping someone someday might understand. The identity of Clara Beaumont brought a new, heartbreaking dimension to the entire ordeal. Eleanor uncovered fragments of her life, her love for poetry, her dreams of opening her own dressmaking shop, her close bond with her younger sister. Her life was tragically cut short, her hopes and aspirations extinguished by Finch's depravity. Details of her family, her aspirations, and her eventual, unexplained disappearance from London society now painted a vivid picture of a life stolen. Her story evoked profound empathy in Eleanor, sparking a fierce desire for justice, not just for Clara, but for all of Finch's forgotten victims. The research highlighted the horrific consequences of the binding ritual. Not only was Clara's spirit trapped, forced into an eternal, agonizing stasis within the canvas, but the ritual also required a continuous feeding or sacrifice. Finch, Eleanor discovered, maintained the binding through further dark practices, ensuring the entity's continued imprisonment and Clara's suffering. He had created a self-sustaining cycle of torment, with Clara's anguish fueling the grotesque entity hidden beneath the paint, which in turn amplified her suffering. Information about Finch's eventual demise was murky, shrouded in rumor. Some accounts suggested a violent end, others a sudden, inexplicable illness. What was clear, however, was that the binding ritual was left unfinished or imperfect at the time of his death. This led to Finch's ultimate downfall, perhaps a karmic retribution, or perhaps the entity itself, partially unbound, turned on its master. His death, however, did not release Clara or the entity. Instead, it left both in a state of tormented limbo, the ritual's power lingering, a malevolent echo across time. The portrait was now understood by Eleanor not just as a haunted object, but as a chilling monument to Finch's evil and Clara's profound suffering. It was not merely haunted, it was a repository of pain and malevolence, a focal point where a life was stolen and a soul was imprisoned. The unsettling detail, the grotesque face, was a permanent scar, a visible manifestation of the dark act, a constant reminder of the tragedy etched into the very fabric of the canvas. Eleanor faced a profound moral dilemma. The academic in her wanted to preserve the artifact, to study it, to understand its historical significance. But the human in her, now deeply connected to Clara's plight, wrestled with a different imperative. Should she destroy the portrait, thereby releasing the malevolent entity and potentially erasing Clara's last physical trace, or should she attempt to cleanse it, to free Clara's spirit, risking further danger from the entity now tethered to it? The weight of responsibility fell heavily upon her shoulders. She knew she could not ignore the suffering bound within the canvas. She had to find a way to break the binding, not just to protect others, but to honor Clara's memory and finally grant her peace. The question was how, and what would be the cost? The paranormal activity around the portrait reached a critical level that week. It wasn't just cold spots and flickering lights anymore. Objects started moving on their own. A heavy art book on Eleanor's desk flew across the room, hitting the wall with a loud thud, narrowly missing her head. Violent temperature drops became common. Sudden chills that made the hairs on her arms stand up, even in the warmest parts of the museum. Guttural whispers, faint at first, grew louder, swirling around the portrait, sometimes forming indistinct words that seemed to mock her efforts. The museum staff were now openly terrified. Several guards refused to do their night rounds near the gallery where the portrait hung, citing unsettling feelings and strange noises. One cleaner quit on the spot after claiming she saw the woman in the painting's eyes follow her across the room, a cold, empty stare that froze her to the bone. Attendance had plummeted. The museum now felt like a tomb, visited only by Eleanor, who was trapped in a relentless cycle of research and growing dread. Eleanor herself began to experience direct, albeit fragmented, communication from the entity. It wasn't through clear words, but through overwhelming emotions that washed over her like waves. Fleeting visions, like quick flashes behind her eyes, showed glimpses of a dark, swirling void, then intense suffering, then a raging, consuming anger. Sometimes telepathic impressions, like a cold hand pressing on her mind, conveyed raw feelings of being trapped, of immense power struggling to break free, and a desperate desire for release. She felt Clara's suffering, a deep, pervasive ache of sorrow and regret, but it was often overshadowed by the entity's sheer malevolence, its rage a burning fire that threatened to consume everything. The entity within the portrait, now more active and aware of Eleanor's presence, attempted to manipulate her. It projected illusions, showing her distorted images of Clara pleading for help, her face a mask of agony. It preyed on Eleanor's deepest fears, whispering doubts about her sanity, about her ability to ever truly understand or control something so ancient and dark. Sometimes it offered false promises of knowledge or power, hinting at secrets that could be hers if she simply released it, if she gave in to its influence. The goal was clear: to trick her into breaking the binding in a way that benefited the entity, not the trapped soul of Clara. It wanted to be free, and it didn't care about the cost. The constant exposure to the portrait, to the entity's presence, and its relentless attempts at manipulation took a severe toll on Eleanor's mental and physical health. Insomnia became her constant companion, her nights plagued by vivid nightmares that left her waking in a cold sweat. The grotesque face of the entity burned into her mind. Paranoia gnawed at her, making her jump at every shadow, every creak of the old museum building. Extreme fatigue became her normal state, her body feeling heavy and unresponsive. She experienced vivid waking nightmares, moments where the museum walls seemed to melt, hot, or the air shimmered with unseen forces. She questioned her own sanity, fearing she was succumbing to the portrait's influence, that her mind was breaking under the strain. Was she truly seeing these things, or was the entity slowly driving her mad? The portrait's malevolence began to affect people beyond Eleanor, though they didn't realize the source. Visitors to the museum, few as they were, reported disturbing experiences. Some felt overwhelming sadness in random galleries, others sudden, blinding headaches. A few claimed to hear faint, disembodied cries. The decline in attendance was partly due to the museum's growing reputation as unsettling. A sense of dread and unease permeated the entire building. A thick, palpable atmosphere that made even the most stoic staff members feel uncomfortable. It was as if the museum itself was slowly becoming infected by the portrait's dark energy. Eleanor realized that the entity's increasing power wasn't just a threat to her or the museum, it was further tormenting the bound woman, Clara. The visions and emotional surges made it clear. Clara's spirit was not merely trapped but actively suffering, her anguish a constant, agonizing hum that fed the malevolent entity. Every surge of fear, every flicker of rage from the entity was fueled by Clara's pain. The need to free Clara became Eleanor's primary, overriding motivation. It was no longer just about intellectual curiosity or even professional responsibility. It was a moral imperative, a desperate plea for justice for a soul long tormented. Frantically, Eleanor searched for a way to break the binding safely. She delved deeper into the obscure texts, poring over ancient grimoires, forgotten rituals, and protective spells. She looked for counter-rituals, methods of exorcism that could specifically target a binding of this nature. The challenge was immense. She needed to release Clara's spirit, to grant her peace without unleashing the malevolent entity that had been feeding on her for over a century. It was a delicate dance, a tightrope walk between liberation and catastrophe. Every book she read, every cryptic passage she deciphered, only underscored the immense danger of her task. A particularly violent and terrifying manifestation served as a clear warning that time was running out. One evening, alone in the gallery, the portrait began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of ozone and decay. The grotesque face hidden within the painting seemed to twist and writhe, its tiny, malevolent eyes burning like embers. Then, a chilling, unearthly shriek tore through the silence, echoing in the empty halls. It wasn't a human scream, but something far older, far more sinister. The sound was so intense that Eleanor dropped to her knees, clutching her head, her ears ringing. It was a demonstration of the entity's raw power and its malicious intent. Eleanor understood then, with a cold certainty, that if she failed, if she didn't act quickly, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for her, but for everyone and everything around the museum. The entity was ready to break free, with or without her help, and when it did, it would unleash untold horror upon the world. The desperate plan began to form in Eleanor's mind, a complex tapestry woven from historical knowledge and arcane lore. It was a risky endeavor, a gamble against forces she barely understood, but she saw no other path. She envisioned a carefully constructed ritual, one that would require specific objects, precise timing, and an unwavering will. Her goal was clear: to sever the connection between Clara's bound spirit and the malevolent entity, and then finally to release Clara's soul from its century-long torment. Meticulously, Eleanor began to gather the necessary components for the counter-ritual. Days blurred into nights as she scoured dusty antique shops, specialized occult bookstores, and even contacted obscure collectors she knew through her art history circles. Though she offered vague academic reasons for her unusual requests, she acquired ancient texts, not just for their knowledge, but for their very presence, believing the energy they held would be crucial. She sought consecrated items, a silver chalice that had once belonged to a priest known for his protective blessings, a small, polished obsidian mirror said to reflect negative energies. Specific herbs, chosen for their spiritual cleansing and banishing properties, were carefully dried and bundled. Protective symbols, drawn from various traditions, were meticulously copied onto parchment. Each item, no matter how small, held a symbolic or energetic significance in the intricate unbinding process she was designing. She checked and rechecked her list, her mind racing with every detail, every potential pitfall. The weight of Clara's suffering and the looming threat of the entity fueled her every move. Finally, the night of the ritual arrived. Eleanor had chosen a moonless night, believing the absence of lunar light would enhance the ritual's potency. She prepared the gallery space, transforming it from a public exhibition hall into a temporary ritual chamber. She closed and locked the museum doors, making sure every window was covered, every crack sealed. Protective circles were drawn on the floor with consecrated chalk, intricate patterns meant to contain and channel energy. Candles, specially prepared with banishing oils, were lit at precise points around the portrait, their flickering flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. Wards, small charms and symbols were placed at every entrance and corner of the room, creating a barrier against unwanted intrusions. The atmosphere was thick, almost suffocating, charged with anticipation and a palpable sense of dread. The air hummed with an unseen energy, a silent prelude to the battle she was about to wage. As Eleanor began the ritual, her voice, though trembling slightly, rose with resolute determination, reciting the ancient incantations she had painstakingly translated. The portrait, as if sensing the challenge, reacted violently. The room plunged into an inky darkness, the candle flames guttering and struggling against an unseen force, their light barely piercing the gloom. The air became thick, heavy with an oppressive, suffocating energy that pressed in on Eleanor from all sides. The grotesque hidden face on the portrait, now fully exposed by the previous scans, seemed to writhe and contort, its features shifting in agony and rage. The woman's painted form, Clara's image, distorted, her serene expression twisting into a silent scream that tore at Eleanor's heart. The struggle for control began in earnest. Eleanor continued her recitation, her voice growing stronger, even as the entity fought back with increasing ferocity. It lashed out with psychic attacks, waves of pure terror and despair washing over her, threatening to drown her resolve. Physical manifestations erupted around her. Unseen hands pushed at her. Cold spots moved through the room like specters, and the whispers intensified, hissing threats and promises of doom. Eleanor gripped the chalice, her knuckles white, her body shaking, but she held her ground. She had to maintain her focus, resisting the overwhelming fear and despair that the entity tried to feed her. She visualized Clara, her suffering, her need for release, and that image became her shield, her anchor in the storm of malevolence. At the climax of the ritual, as Eleanor poured the consecrated water from the silver chalice over the painting, a powerful surge of energy ripped through the room. There was a brilliant, blinding flash of pure white light that momentarily eclipsed the darkness, followed by a profound, almost audible sigh that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the painting. In that fleeting moment, the woman's painted face briefly softened, her eyes, once filled with torment, flickering with a fleeting expression of peace, perhaps even gratitude. A gentle breeze, cool and clean, swept through the room, though all the doors and windows remained sealed. It was a sense of profound emptiness, not of loss, but of a burden lifted, a spirit finally free. Clara's departure was silent, ethereal, yet undeniably real, but the entity remained, and it was furious. Stripped of its host, of the constant anguish it had fed upon for so long, the malevolent entity unleashed a final, terrifying burst of pure, unadulterated rage. The room was ravaged, as if by an invisible tempest. Objects shattered against the walls, the furniture violently overturned, and the remaining candles were snuffed out, plunging the gallery into absolute darkness. A guttural, primal shriek, far more terrifying than any before, echoed through the museum, shaking the very foundations of the old building. The hidden face on the portrait, now devoid of Clara's agony, contorted into a mask of pure hatred, its tiny eyes burning with a cold, dead light. Eleanor, physically and emotionally exhausted but triumphant, pushed through the remaining chaos. She completed the final step of the ritual, using the obsidian mirror to reflect and seal the binding, severing the entity's connection to the portrait once and for all. As she did, the portrait visibly changed. The grotesque detail, the face of hatred, began to fade, becoming indistinct, an innocuous smudge of paint. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, receding like a tide, leaving behind a chilling, almost reverent silence. The active malevolence was gone. The portrait was no longer a conduit for dread, but a somber canvas, its power inert, its dark history now just a memory etched in paint. The silence that followed the ritual was profound, almost deafening after the cacophony of the entity's rage. A deep stillness settled over the gallery, a tangible calm replacing the oppressive dread that had clung to the air for so long. Eleanor, her body aching, her mind reeling from the intensity of the confrontation, slowly surveyed the damage. Furniture lay overturned, shards of glass from shattered display cases glittered on the polished floor, and the air still carried the faint, acrid scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and foul. Yet amidst the wreckage, the portrait hung serenely on the wall, a mere painting once more. Its malevolent power had vanished, leaving behind only the ghost of its dark history. She approached it cautiously, her heart still thrumming with residual adrenaline. The change was undeniable. The hidden, grotesque detail, once so vivid and terrifying, was no longer visible. It had faded into an indistinct smudge within the painted texture, a scar on the canvas, but no longer an active, malevolent presence. The woman's face, though still melancholic, now carried a subtle hint of peace, a quiet release that hadn't been there before. Her eyes, no longer burning with unnatural intensity, held a faint, distant gaze, as if looking towards a horizon unseen. The portrait was no longer a conduit for dread. It was a somber memorial, a testament to a life tragically bound and finally freed. Eleanor's recovery was slow, both physically and emotionally. The exhaustion was immense, a deep weariness that seeped into her bones. The vivid nightmares which had plagued her for weeks gradually ceased, replaced by a restful, dreamless sleep she hadn't experienced in months. However, the memory of the entity's presence, its raw hatred, and the terror it had inflicted remained etched in her mind. Her understanding of art, history, and indeed reality itself had been irrevocably altered. She had stepped through a veil, glimpsing a truth that most people would never comprehend, and that knowledge was a heavy burden to carry. The museum eventually reopened, its staff still shaken but relieved to be free of the oppressive atmosphere that had pervaded the building. The gallery where the portrait hung was now viewed with a different reverence, a hushed respect. Visitors might still feel a faint unease, a lingering echo of the past, a subtle chill in the air, but the active threat was gone. The story of the portrait, once a terrifying secret, became a whispered legend among the staff, a cautionary tale passed down in hushed tones, a reminder of the strange things that can hide within seemingly ordinary objects. Eleanor made sure that the true story of Clara, the woman in the portrait, was known and honored. She compiled a detailed report outlining Clara's tragic life, her forced participation in the ritual, and her eventual release. A small, discreet plaque was placed next to the painting, briefly telling her story, acknowledging her suffering, and ensuring her memory was no longer overshadowed by the entity that had bound her. It was a silent tribute, a quiet act of justice for a soul tormented for over a century. While the immediate threat was gone, certain questions lingered, echoing in the quiet corners of Eleanor's mind. What truly happened to the malevolent entity after its expulsion? Was it truly gone, utterly destroyed, or merely displaced, cast back into some shadowy realm from which it might one day return? The possibility gnawed at her, a chilling reminder that some darknesses are never truly vanquished, only contained. And if such a powerful entity could be bound into a painting, what other cursed artifacts existed in the world, waiting to be discovered, waiting to unleash their own horrors? The thought was unsettling, a vast, unexplored territory of the unknown. Eleanor was no longer just an art historian. She was a survivor, a guardian against unseen forces, her expertise now extending far beyond the academic. Her unique experience made her a formidable figure, her insights into the esoteric world invaluable. She carried a new burden of knowledge and responsibility, a silent vow to protect others from similar fates. She knew that her life, her perspective, had been permanently reshaped by the portrait and its dark secret. In the end, the portrait stood as a chilling reminder of the thin veil between art and the unknown, between history and the supernatural. It was a testament to the idea that some objects are not merely inanimate, but hold a fragment of humanity's darkest secrets, echoes of rituals long forgotten, and the suffering of souls unjustly bound. It served as a chilling reminder that some mysteries are better left undisturbed, their secrets buried deep in the past. Yet Eleanor also knew that some mysteries, especially those involving profound injustice and suffering, demanded to be confronted, no matter the cost, no matter the lingering shadow they left behind. Her journey had ended, but her understanding of the world had only just begun.